Hello, I'm Lant Pritchett, and this is part 3 of a set of lectures on conceptualizing education systems. In the first part, we talked about why one needs a system approach. In the second part, we laid out a very specific approach to a system that is a accountability-focused approach that has a common analytical basis. Now, here in part 3, what I want to do is move to the use of that framework. Our broad conjecture in the RISE research agenda is that the reason why some country systems perform better than others, and the reason why some systems have strengthened and others weakened, is driven by whether or not the education systems have managed to maintain a coherence around achieving learning outcomes. And that when the system as a whole is reasonably coherent around achieving learning outcomes, it's able to maintain itself and reproduce itself and continue and perhaps even improve on quality. And when a system becomes incoherent around learning objectives, its ability to accomplish that task can deteriorate, often very sharply. But coherence is a property of systems, and I want to start with is what I call escape from tautology ontology. Nearly all of us, nearly all the time, operate with a basic ontology, the structure of what is, that we kind of mastered by the time we were 3 years old. And what that is that as we're trying to understand what's happening in the world and how we should react to it in order to accomplish our objectives, pretty much by the time we're 3 years old, we've divided the world into stuff. And stuff has properties. And if we want to understand and manipulate stuff, we need to understand its properties. And the second kind of thing in the world are agents. Agents are human beings and cats and dogs and other things that act. And if we want to understand agents, we need to understand their purposes and intentions. So we kind of understand the world as either, if we say, why did something happen, or how would I accomplish a given objective, we assume that this is reduced to either understanding stuff and its properties, or it's understanding agents and their motivations, which are driven by teleological intentions and motivations. The problem is there's a third kind of thing in the world called a system. And even when agents with exactly the same intentions and motivations are embedded in different relationships between those agents, i.e. a different system, you can produce terrible outcomes from the system. And the system and the structure of the system is in fact the cause of the outcomes. So countries that are poor and remain poor are not poor because they're full of poor people. They remain poor because people are living in environments in which they have not been able to structure the system of the economy where they work in order to unleash the underlying productive potential of the people living there. And so that is a system property. And it's really difficult to conceptualize because since we are 3 years old, we have successfully manipulated the world without the ontological concept of a causal explanation in terms of systems. So that's, and so when I say coherence, coherence isn't a property of a person. Coherence isn't a property of stuff. A chair doesn't have coherence and a person doesn't have coherence. Coherence is a way we characterize a system. And in a system, in our 5x4 framework, there are 3 types of incoherence. There's kind of cell by cell versus coherence of a column. And so there's conflicts and incoherence sort of across columns between what the state wants from education versus what parents want. Or there's conflict between the relationships. Teachers in a school might be accountable to different actors. The parents might want one thing and the Ministry of Education might want another thing from them. So let's talk first about incoherence within a relationship of accountability. So for instance, You start with a management relationship between a Ministry of Education, say, and headmasters and teachers. And there can be all kinds of incoherence between the 5 elements of that management relationship. First, there could be an incoherence of delegation between the delegation and the magnitude of structure and finance. Many governments ask Ministry of Education, formally and through legislation, to accomplish many, many more goals than is even conceivably possible with the amount and structure of finance that they give to the ministry. So that already starts with an incoherence. I cannot hold you accountable for doing something for which I didn't provide you adequate finance. And since the accountability relationship breaks down there, if you come to me and you say, I'll pay you $100 if you flap your arms and fly around the room, we're already stuck into a relationship of accountability that's going to lead to no good, because I can't flap my arms and fly around the room no matter how much you pay me. So the first incoherence is if the delegation is incompatible with the finance, you can't therefore build any accountability into that relationship. A second incoherence is the incoherence between delegation and information. So for instance, many governments establish a huge array of educational goals for which they hope the system will aspire and accomplish, and yet they only measure very few of those goals. So many systems have almost no regular, reliable, relevant measurement of the progress of student learning, but they have amazingly detailed information about enrollments. And they often have amazingly detailed elements about enrollments because the financial flows, what a school gets in terms of stipends or finance for this or that, may depend on the number of, legitimately, on the number of kids enrolled in the school. And hence, information about enrollment becomes very high stakes and very kind of contested and very well tracked, whereas information about learning is completely absent, in spite of the fact that in the delegation goal, it was articulated that children learning was an important priority. So that's a second incoherence in a given relationship. Third, there can be incoherence of delegation and motivation. Again, in many systems around the world, there are learning goals that are articulated, part of a broad array of goals of what countries and ministries say they want to be accomplished. And yet, if you look at the way in which teacher employment and compensation is structured, it doesn't hinge on performance of any of those things. So it's no guarantee that a teacher is happier if the goals of the ministry have actually been accomplished versus they have not been accomplished, which tends to erode norms, both direct and extrinsic motivation, as well as erode over time extrinsic motivation. You can create cultures in which you're seen as a fool almost if you have complied and provided effort to provide a great education for the children you're working with, because there are the structure of rewards and motivations is not geared to reward that behavior. So that's, and I'm just giving examples of incoherence within a single relationship. This table provides a different example of incoherence in the compact relationship, which is between the executive decision-making apparatus of the state and, for instance, a Ministry of Education or other large-scale organizational provider of education. And again, we can have inconsistency between what the government says they want and the resources they provide. They can be inconsistency between what they say they want and the information that's collected or demanded by the relationship between the executive authority and the organizational providers. And again, motivation. It could well be that organizations that provide schooling that cream skim students look like they have great performance and get highly rewarded, even though they haven't provided significant learning value added. They've just cream skim students. So you can create these relationships and accountability in ways that are coherent between delegation, finance, the information you collect on performance, and the motivation of the agents as a result of the information, or you can create them, and they're often been very created, in which they're just not really coherent, and in particular, they're not really coherent around promoting learning outcomes. So that's a first type of coherence, and you see that this is a property not of the agents, but of the system. It's the structure of the relationship between the agents that leads to perverse or terrible outcomes, even though in many ways there might be very many well-meaning people trying to do the best they can within the constraints and confines of the systemic structure. The second type of incoherence is incoherence between the same element across relationships. So for instance, if we look at the overall 5x4 table, in each of the relationships between citizens and the state and the organization, between the organizations and the front line, between the parents and the school itself, there's an information component. But often those informations are very different and more or less relevant to what the principals actually want. So for instance, in the management relationship between the Ministry of Education and schools, they're often demanding very process compliance and thin input information. That is, they want to know that the school has, obeyed certain directives of the ministry. They want to know that the school has a boundary wall, doesn't has a boundary wall, has the number of desks that were sent and they're each registered or not. And that providing that information that demonstrates compliance can become an important, independent, almost objective of the management of the school, whereas the information the parents want to know is, how well is the school doing at equipping my child to succeed in life? Which is a deep and complex kind of information a parent might want. So in many ways, these incoherences in relationship can lead actors to be torn between very different types of behavior. Do you just engage in process compliance and provide the bureaucracy of the ministry with the information they want, or does one really dig in and try and create the information that's relevant and reliable and regular to parents of how am I doing the best I can with equipping these children to be successful in their lives? So this is again just an illustration which you can look at later at the differences between the kinds of information that might be a component of each of the different 4 principal-agent relationships. So we've just highlighted one of the design elements, which is information, and shown how there might be very different types of information created and used that create entirely different kind of objectives and motivations of the different actors, so that the system isn't coherent about what are we really relying on, what do we really want to accomplish here. The third type of incoherence is between entire relationships. So, for instance, in the principal-agent relationship, the frontline teachers and principals are both inside in the public sector, or often inside a very large and powerful bureaucracy, and they are agents of the principal of the Ministry of Education, but at the same time, they are also the agents of the direct principals of the parents, students, and communities in which they're engaged, and that can create huge and almost irreconcilable tensions for the frontline teachers and principals in how to operate the school if there's misalignment between the objectives of the ministry and the objectives of the parents. So that incoherence, again, can lead to different behaviors and less than kind of common purposes among the actors in the education system towards achieving good learning outcomes. So in many of the public sector systems, the long route has kind of completely eliminated the short route. The parents as actual actors, their role in actually being able to be engaged in the school has often been very limited, and hence the schools become almost entirely accountable to a thin information managed top-down bureaucracy, which can work and has worked in some cases to create good education. But the problem is a thin top-down bureaucracy, when it fails almost completely, and having disarticulated schools from their community and parent roots can lead to really disastrous outcomes. So because of the incoherence in the kind of overall structure between these two relationships of accountability. Here, again, we've highlighted two different relationships of accountability in 5x4 framework, and then highlighted how across these columns you're leading to agents inside the schools that are under two very different pressures between what the ministry is wanting and what the parents are wanting. So that kind of incoherence can also be very damaging to creating a system that accomplishes the purposes of achieving high universal, equitable, and deep learning outcomes. Now, there are many ways to achieve coherence, and we use the word coherence carefully because we're not imagining that the system becomes uniformly driven, that inevitably schooling is going to be contested. I mean, schooling is a process of determining what our children will know and do as adults and what the society will be like, and there will obviously be contestation around this. We're not imagining that it kind of aligns on a single objective, but and one can create coherence inside systems in very different ways. One doesn't come away from a coherence analysis saying you need top-down schools or you need bottom-up schools. You come away from saying, in this context, how would we structure a set of coherent relationships that are coherent around achieving desirable learning outcomes. Now, the main kind of final takeaway of this is that there is a very important kind of line of advocacy out there that suggests that piecemeal can fix problems. Sometimes piecemeal can make minor progress, but when the system is truly deeply incoherent, oftentimes the efforts to create piecemeal reforms can work in a microcosm, but never truly be allowed to scale and have the overall change that systems need. So the system approach wants to say, if you are taking a piecemeal approach, what's the causal pathway whereby it becomes embodied in a system that's going to produce these desirable outcomes as the routine operation of the system, as opposed to a standalone project driven by some particularly dynamic leader, or a standalone project of some particularly dynamic donor, or a standalone project of some particularly successful NGO. We have to ask, how does the system itself identify and foment the kinds of behaviors that are going to lead to the routine operation of the system, leading to better and better learning outcomes over time. So that's how we start to think about using the system framework to analyze its components within and across relationships of accountability in analytic terms, so that we can start identifying the deep underlying structural causes of good or bad performance. Thank you very much.